Now let's go deeper into the first type, the validation addict, because this is where many people get trapped without even realizing it. At the beginning, everything feels incredible. She's expressive, engaging, responsive. She laughs at your jokes, compliments you, makes you feel seen in a way that feels almost rare. And naturally, you interpret that as connection. You think, this is different. This is real. But what you're actually experiencing isn't depth. It's amplification. It's the reflection of attention, not the presence of genuine emotional investment. You have to understand something fundamental about human psychology. When a person depends on external validation, they are not interacting with you, they are interacting with the feeling you give them. And those are two very different things, because if it's about the feeling, then you are replaceable, not because you lack value, but because the source of validation can always be substituted. So what happens over time? The dynamic shifts. In the beginning, you feel chosen. But slowly, almost invisibly, you start feeling evaluated. You notice her attention isn't stable. It fluctuates depending on who else is around, what environment she's in, how much attention she's receiving elsewhere. And you begin to compensate. You try a little harder. You give a little more, you become slightly more performative, even if you don't realize it consciously. This is where the trap tightens, because the more you invest in trying to secure her attention, the more you reinforce the very dynamic that keeps you unstable. You're no longer building a connection, you're feeding a cycle. And cycles don't lead to fulfillment, they lead to exhaustion. Philosophically, this comes down to a deeper truth. You cannot build something real with someone who is not internally anchored. If a person's sense of worth is outsourced to the outside world, then their emotions will always be dictated by that world. And that means your place in their life will never feel secure, not because they intend to hurt you, but because they themselves are not grounded. And here's the part most people don't want to hear. This has nothing to do with how good you are. You could be attentive, strong, emotionally intelligent, and still lose in this situation. Because you're playing a game where the rules are constantly changing and the goal is never truly defined. Think about it. Real connection is built on consistency, presence, and depth. But validation addiction thrives on novelty, attention spikes, and external feedback. Those two systems are fundamentally incompatible. One seeks stability, the other seeks stimulation. So you find yourself in a silent conflict. You want to build something meaningful while she unconsciously seeks something that keeps her feeling desired. And desire, when it's externally driven, always demands more. More attention, more reassurance, more proof. It's a hunger that doesn't get satisfied. It just temporarily quiets down before returning stronger. And eventually, you start to feel it. That subtle anxiety, that quiet sense of not being enough even when you're doing everything right. That internal question, why does this feel so unstable? That feeling is your awareness trying to wake you up. Because the truth is, you're not lacking. You are misaligned. When you're dealing with someone who needs validation more than connection, the relationship becomes transactional at an emotional level. You give attention, they give affection. But the moment the attention shifts, the affection weakens. And that's not love. That's dependency disguised as intimacy. Now, this doesn't mean she's a bad person. It means she's uncentered. And until someone learns to generate their own sense of worth, they will unconsciously extract it from others. That's not a foundation you can build a life on. It's a pattern you get lost in. So the real question becomes, are you trying to be chosen, or are you choosing wisely? Because one will keep you chasing, and the other will keep you grounded. And if there's one thing to take away from this, it's this. Never confuse attention with intention, because one is easy to give, but the other reveals where someone truly stands. Now let's talk about something that often gets mistaken for passion, but is actually something far more destabilizing: the emotional roller coaster. At first glance, this type of dynamic feels electric. It feels alive. There's intensity in the way she speaks. Intensity in how quickly things move, intensity in how strongly emotions are expressed. And for many people, especially those who have experienced emotional dullness in the past, this intensity feels like relief. It feels like finally something real is happening. But here's where perception becomes dangerous. What you're calling chemistry is often not compatibility, it's volatility. And volatility is addictive because the human nervous system is wired to respond strongly to uncertainty. When something is unpredictable, your mind becomes more engaged. You think about it more. You analyze it more. You chase clarity, and that psychological engagement can easily be mistaken for emotional depth. But engagement is not stability. In these dynamics, the pattern usually follows a predictable cycle. There are moments of extreme closeness where everything feels aligned, where she's affectionate, expressive, emotionally open. And then, almost without warning, there are emotional drops, distance, coldness, withdrawal. confusion, and you're left trying to decode what changed. This inconsistency creates something powerful in the brain: intermittent reinforcement. It's the same psychological mechanism behind addiction. When rewards are unpredictable, the brain releases more dopamine in anticipation. So instead of feeling secure in the relationship, you become conditioned to chase the next high moment. This is where things quietly shift. You stop experiencing the relationship as peace and start experiencing it as emotional management. You begin monitoring tone, timing, mood shifts. You adjust your behavior to avoid triggering withdrawal. You become more careful with your words, more strategic with your presence, not because you want control, but because you're trying to restore stability in something that never had it. And here's the truth most people only realize when they're already deeply involved. Passion that constantly destabilizes you is not passion. It's emotional turbulence disguised as connection. Real connection expands your nervous system. It creates space, not tension. It brings clarity, not confusion. But emotional roller coasters shrink your internal world. You become hyper-aware, reactive, and dependent on emotional signals that are inconsistent by nature. Philosophically, this reflects a deeper imbalance. When love is rooted in instability, it becomes something you manage rather than something you experience. And anything that requires constant management is not grounded, it is fragile. Now, why does this happen in some people? Often, emotional roller coasters are not intentional. They are the external expression of internal instability. A person who has not regulated their own emotional world will often unconsciously externalize that chaos into their relationships, not because they want drama, but because they have never learned emotional equilibrium. But regardless of intention, the impact on you remains the same. You cannot build long-term emotional safety in an environment that is structurally inconsistent. You can adapt, you can endure, you can even normalize it, but you cannot find peace in it. And over time, your own emotional baseline begins to shift. What once felt uncomfortable starts to feel normal. And that is the most dangerous transformation of all, when instability becomes your new definition of love. This is where many people lose themselves. Not suddenly, but gradually. They become more tolerant of confusion, more accepting of emotional unpredictability, more willing to explain away behavior that their intuition already understands. And the cost is internal exhaustion, because your mind is always trying to solve an equation that has no stable variables. And the human psyche cannot sustain that level of uncertainty indefinitely without consequence. So you have to ask yourself a difficult question. Are you experiencing love, or are you experiencing emotional stimulation disguised as love? Because one builds your nervous system, the other breaks it down slowly while keeping you emotionally engaged. And if there's one truth to take from this, it's simple but powerful. Anything that keeps you emotionally unstable is not leading you toward connection. It is training you to normalize chaos. Now let's move into something more subtle, but just as important: the opportunist dynamic. At first, this one is harder to detect because it rarely announces itself. It doesn't show up as obvious manipulation or emotional chaos. In fact, it often starts in a way that feels very structured, even stable. She seems composed, observant, interested in your life, your ambitions, your direction. And naturally, you interpret that as emotional maturity. But over time, you begin to notice something underneath the surface. The connection seems to be organized around what you have, not who you are. Now, let's be precise here, because this is not about materialism in the shallow sense. This is about alignment of interest versus alignment of character. In genuine connection, people are drawn to your values, your mindset, your presence, things that exist independently of circumstance. But in opportunistic dynamics, the attraction is conditional. It rises and falls based on utility, and that's where the shift begins. At first, you might not notice it because it's subtle. She appreciates your ambition. She respects your direction. She enjoys the lifestyle you provide, the access you offer, the stability you represent. And all of that feels like appreciation. It feels like admiration. But admiration becomes questionable when it is consistently tied to output rather than essence. You start to realize that her emotional engagement intensifies when your life is expanding, when things are going well, when there's momentum, when there's visible progress. But in moments where things slow down, where uncertainty appears, where you're not at your peak performance, something shifts in her energy too. Not always dramatically, but enough to feel the difference. And this is where awareness begins to form. Because real emotional connection does not fluctuate with external performance. It remains anchored even when circumstances change. But in an opportunistic pattern, the relationship is indirectly tied to perceived value exchange. Not spoken, not negotiated, but felt in behavior, tone, and consistency. Psychologically, this creates pressure. You start associating your worth in the relationship with your output in the world. You feel, even if unconsciously, that you have to maintain a certain level of success to maintain a certain level of affection. And that turns life into performance. You are no longer just building your future. You are maintaining your eligibility in someone's emotional world. And that changes you. Because instead of being loved for your presence, you begin to feel valued for your performance. And performance-based connection always creates anxiety. It introduces a silent fear. What happens if I slow down? What happens if I stop achieving at this level? What happens to how I'm treated? This is not love that supports your growth. This is attention that follows your growth, and those are not the same thing. Philosophically, this reflects a deeper misunderstanding of value. In grounded relationships, value is intrinsic. It exists regardless of external conditions. But in opportunistic dynamics, value becomes instrumental. It is measured by what you can provide in a given moment. And anything that is instrumental can also be replaced when a better instrument appears. That realization is uncomfortable but necessary, because it forces you to confront a difficult truth. Not every form of affection is rooted in emotional depth. Some forms of connection are structured around advantage, even if unconsciously. And when advantage shifts, so does attachment. Now, this doesn't always come from malicious intent. In many cases, it comes from social conditioning, being taught to equate security with attraction, status with emotional safety, or provision with love. But regardless of origin, the pattern produces the same result: conditional connection. And conditional connection always creates instability. As you are never fully safe in it, you are always being evaluated by circumstance. So you begin to ask yourself, am I in a relationship where I am appreciated as a person or evaluated as a resource? Because one allows you to relax into yourself. Because one allows you to relax into yourself. Because one allows you to relax into yourself. The other keeps you in constant subtle pressure to maintain your value in motion. And that distinction is everything. Because the moment love becomes dependent on what you produce rather than who you are, you stop being in a relationship and start being in a system of emotional exchange. And if there's one truth to walk away with here, it's this: if you must constantly earn someone's affection, then you were never truly chosen. You were only temporarily useful. Now let's move into something that many people underestimate until they're already emotionally invested: the past-driven dynamic. This is the type of situation where you meet someone who seems emotionally available on the surface, but underneath that surface, she is still living inside a story that has already ended. And the difficult part is you are not actually entering a clean emotional space. You are stepping into a space that is already occupied. At first, it doesn't always show itself directly. In fact, it often shows up in ways that seem understandable, even relatable. She might talk about past hurt, past betrayal, past disappointment, and as a human being, you naturally respond with empathy. You think, I understand. I can be different. I can be better than what she experienced before. And that is where many people unknowingly step into a psychological pattern they did not create. Because what begins as empathy slowly turns into compensation. Over time, you notice that certain reactions in the present moment are not actually about you. They are echoes of someone else. A situation that has nothing to do with your behavior triggers a response that feels disproper. Chain it to what is happening. You're not being reacted to as a current individual. You're being placed into a previous emotional narrative. And this creates a very specific emotional tension. You start feeling like you are constantly proving that you are not someone else. You are not the past partner. You are not the old wound. You are not the betrayal she experienced before. And yet, no matter how consistent you are, there are moments where you still feel like you are being tested against something you cannot see. This is where the emotional burden begins to form. Because healthy connection operates in the present tense, it responds to what is happening now, not what happened before. But when someone has not processed their emotional history, the present becomes contaminated by the past. And that means your actions are no longer interpreted directly, they are filtered through memory. Psychologically, this creates hypervigilance on both sides. She becomes guarded, scanning for signs that confirm old fears. And you become careful, trying not to trigger those fears. So instead of two people meeting freely, you end up in a subtle negotiation with someone else's unresolved emotional experiences. And here is the part that is often misunderstood. This is not about blame. It is about capacity. Emotional wounds do not disappear just because time passes. They either get processed and integrated, or they get carried forward into new relationships as protective patterns. But the impact on you remains consistent regardless of intention. You begin to feel like you are being evaluated through a lens you did not create. And no matter how much effort you put in, there is always a background sense that you are being measured against a past that cannot be changed. That creates emotional fatigue, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you are trying to stabilize something T. Had is internally unstable, and slowly something shifts in your psychology too. You start adjusting your behavior not based on authenticity, but based on emotional safety. You become more cautious, more calculated, more aware of potential triggers. And without realizing, you begin to lose spontaneity in the relationship. You are no longer simply present, you are managing emotional risk. This is where relationships lose their natural flow, because real connection allows you to be seen as you are, not as a replacement for someone else's unresolved story. But when past pain is still active, the present relationship becomes a testing ground rather than a living experience. Philosophically, this reflects something deeper about human attachment. Unresolved pain seeks continuity. It doesn't stay in the past, it looks for new context to express itself. And if awareness is not present, new relationships become the stage where old emotions replay themselves with new characters. And you cannot build stability in a system where the emotional rules are inherited from a previous chapter. So at some point, you have to ask yourself a very grounded question. Am I being experienced for who I am, or am I being compared to what came before me? Because one allows growth, the other traps you in emotional repetition. And if there's one truth to take from this, it's simple but powerful. You cannot create a future with someone who is still emotionally negotiating their past, because you will always be building in the shadow of a story that is not yours. Now let's go into something that can feel subtle at first, but over time becomes one of the most psychologically draining dynamics in a relationship: the control-seeking pattern. At the beginning, it rarely looks like control. In fact, it often presents itself as care, involvement, or emotional investment. She might be deeply interested in will you spend your time, who you talk to, what decisions you're making, and at first, that can feel like connection. It can feel like someone is truly invested in your life, but there's a difference between involvement and control, and that difference becomes visible in how freedom is treated. In a healthy dynamic, two people grow together while still maintaining individuality. There's trust in separation, comfort in independence, and space for each person to exist without constant justification. But in a control-based dynamic, that space slowly begins to shrink, not suddenly, but gradually, in ways that are easy to rationalize in the moment. You might notice questions that feel less like curiosity and more like inspection. You might notice emotional reactions that are triggered not by what you did, but by what you didn't do in the exact way expected. You start to feel like certain choices require explanation, not because they are wrong, but because they are not aligned with an internal emotional standard that keeps shifting. And this is where the psychological tension begins. Because control is rarely expressed directly. It is often expressed indirectly through emotional pressure, through guilt, withdrawal, disappointment, or subtle punishment in response to independence. Over time, you begin to learn the system. You start anticipating reactions. You start modifying behavior not because you believe it is wrong, but because you want to avoid emotional friction. And without realizing it, your freedom starts shrinking internally long before it shrinks externally. This is one of the most important psychological shifts to understand. Control does not begin by removing your options. It begins by influencing your decisions while keeping your options technically intact. You are still free, but your choices are increasingly shaped by emotional consequences rather than authentic intention. At that point, the relationship stops being a space of mutual growth and starts becoming a space of emotional regulation for one person and emotional adaptation for the other. Now, philosophically, control often comes from insecurity, not dominance. A person who feels internally uncertain may attempt to stabilize that uncertainty by managing external behavior. If they can predict you, they feel safer. If they can influence your actions, they feel more secure. But the cost of that security is always relational imbalance, because you cannot simultaneously have deep connection and constant control. One requires trust, the other replaces trust with management. And here's where it becomes especially important to pay attention to your internal state. Because in these dynamics, you don't always feel oppressed. You often feel responsible for emotional outcomes, responsible for preventing reactions. You begin to carry a weight that was never assigned to you explicitly, but gradually becomes yours through repetition. And that is how self-abandonment begins. Not through one dramatic moment, but through many small compromises of authenticity. You stop saying certain things to avoid tension. You stop making certain choices to maintain harmony. You start filtering your behavior through the lens of how will this affect her emotional state? And over time, you begin to lose something essential, your internal center. Now, this is not about blaming one person or labeling them as inherently controlling. This is about recognizing a pattern where emotional safety becomes dependent on compliance rather than trust. And any system built on compliance will always require maintenance because it is not stable by nature. Real connection does not require control because it is anchored in trust. It allows space. It tolerates difference. T does not interpret independence as threat, but control-based dynamics interpret independence as distance and distance as danger. And that interpretation creates a cycle where closeness is constantly being enforced rather than naturally experienced. So you eventually reach a point where you have to ask yourself a very honest question. Am I being loved for who I am or managed for who I might become? Because one allows you to expand, the other slowly conditions you to shrink. And if there is one truth to take away from this, it's this. The moment love requires you to constantly negotiate your freedom, you are no longer in a relationship, you are in a carefully maintained emotional boundary. Now let's talk about the final pattern, the illusionist dynamic. This one is especially powerful in today's world because it is reinforced everywhere. Social media, films, music, even casual conversations, all of it subtly shapes an idea of what love is supposed to look like. Perfect moments, effortless chemistry, constant excitement, emotional highs that feel cinematic. And so she doesn't just want love, she wants the idea of love she has been repeatedly exposed to. At first, this doesn't seem like a problem. In fact, it can feel inspiring. She may talk about deep connection, soulmate energy, perfect timing, a kind of emotional intensity that feels almost spiritual. And naturally, you get pulled into that narrative. Because who doesn't want something meaningful? Who doesn't want something that feels larger than life? But slowly, reality begins to enter the picture. Because real relationships are not made of constant peaks. They are made of rhythm, stability, ordinary moments that don't always feel extraordinary, but create something far more important, continuity. And this is where the illusion begins to conflict with reality. You start noticing that expectations are not grounded in fed experience, but in imagined ideals. There is a comparison happening, not between you and another person, but between reality and a mental picture of how things should feel. And no matter how good the real connection is, it is always being measured against something edited, amplified, and unrealistic. And this creates a quiet but persistent dissatisfaction. Because when someone is in love with an idea, no real human being can consistently meet that standard. Not because you are lacking, but because the standard itself is not human. It is constructed from fragments, moments taken out of context, emotional highlights separated from the reality that produced them. Psychologically, this leads to something very destabilizing, emotional disconnection during real connection. Even when things are going well, there can be a subtle sense that something is missing. Not because something is actually missing, but because presence is being compared to fantasy. And this is where relationships start to lose grounding. You may find yourself trying to create more intensity, more emotional moments, more proof of connection. Not because the relationship is failing, but because silence and stability begin to feel insufficient. And so you start performing connection instead of experiencing it. You try to recreate the feeling of early excitement, the emotional peaks, the unpredictability that initially felt like chemistry. But here is the paradox. The more you chase intensity, the less stable the relationship becomes. And the less stable it becomes, the more it feels like something is wrong, even if nothing is actually wrong beyond unrealistic expectation. Philosophically, this reflects a deeper human tendency. We often confuse emotional stimulation with emotional depth. But stimulation is temporary by nature. It rises quickly and it fades just as quickly. Depth, on the other hand, is not loud. It is not constantly dramatic. It is built in consistency, presence, and shared reality over time. The illusionist dynamic struggles with this distinction because stillness can feel like absence. Routine can feel like decline. Predictability can feel like loss of interest. And as a result, there is a constant unconscious pressure to reintroduce emotional excitement into the relationship, even when what is actually needed is grounding. And this is where misunderstandings begin to accumulate. You may feel like you are building something stable, while she feels like the emotional spark is fading. But in reality, nothing has disappeared. Only the intensity of novelty has settled into something more sustainable. And if that transition is not understood, it can create unnecessary distance, confusion, or dissatisfaction that has no real root in incompatibility, only an expectation. Now, this is not about dismissing imagination or emotional expression. It is about recognizing when imagination starts overriding reality. Because when someone is more committed to how love should feel than how love actually functions, they will always feel slightly disconnected from what they have. And that creates a cycle of seeking something better, something more aligned with the internal fantasy, something that feels like the ideal version of connection. But that ideal never stabilizes because it was never grounded in real human behavior to begin with. So eventually, you are faced with a very important realization: you cannot build a lasting bond with someone who is more attached to an idea than to the reality standing in front of them. Because real love is not an illusion maintained, it is a reality accepted. And if there is one final truth to take from this entire pattern, it is this: when someone is in love with an image of love, they will always miss the person who is actually try. In chi to love them.